As we're getting started this morning on this message, I'd like to take this opportunity to take a survey, if you don't mind. Just few questions for you to answer. You ready? How many of you, by a show of hands, how many of you have ever gone skydiving? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Thank you. How many of you have ever gone scuba diving? Oh, more. Under the water with a tank, I'm talking about. Scuba diving. Okay, good. How many of you have ever been river rafting? Oh, a lot more. Look at this, river rafters. Excellent, thank you. How many of you have ever flown in a helicopter? Wow, okay. How many of you have ever rappelled off a cliff with a rope? Okay. How many of you have climbed a tree with just spikes on your feet and a belt and cut the tree down? Okay, there's a couple. How many of you have done all of the things I just said? No one. Okay, interesting. So I'm wondering, now that we've done this is a good indication. I'm wondering how many of you would describe yourself in terms of adventure. Do you like to try new things? Sometimes even stepping beyond the bounds of what would be termed safe? Are you easily wearied with what some would call the comfort zone? You don't like the comfort zone? Are you not into routine, but rather you look for ways to encounter new things throughout your week? If you found yourself raising your hand many times just recently, I would guess I just described you. Or would you more accurately be described as someone who is risk averse? There's some of you that didn't raise your hand at all. You prefer certainty over uncertainty. You want to know what to expect. It's not uncommon for you to ask questions like, so what's the plan here? You value predictability, even to the point that some would think is maybe boring. If this is you, I want to give you fair warning this morning that this message may be a bit of a challenge for you. See what I did there? Risk-averse people don't like surprises. So there's your warning. As I read this parable that we've heard this morning, it's clear to me that this story all comes to focus on one encounter, one exchange of words in the story. It's a long story, fairly long, but there are several interchanges here. And let's see if you agree with me on which one of the interchanges is the most important. Jesus told this parable right after repeating a warning, like I said, to keep awake. This is also something he said earlier in Matthew chapter 24, verse 42. There's a theme in this last section of Jesus' teaching. There's a theme here about some of Jesus' most challenging teaching and including these on wakefulness. The first word in this passage, in verse 14, in the original language, is the word hosper. It's a Greek word, and it basically means just as, or it can even be translated exactly like. So he's saying, you want to know what it means to be fully awake, to be truly awake? It's just like this. And then he tells the story, the parable of the talents. I remember hearing Bible teachers warning that the word talent here is not referring to just our being aware of our own giftedness. They said, the word talent here means a big sum of money. And while this is true, it was money, actually lots of money. A talent is a lot of money. It's 15 years' wages of a laborer. Our English word, talent, comes to us because of this parable. It's a good reminder that the New Testament scriptures predate the English language. And as the English language was beginning to be formed and spoken out of Anglo-Saxon and other influences, the word talent was coined to mean your abilities. And it came from this passage. So, while this parable is not only about using your natural giftedness to God, it's also not unrelated. It means talent and more. Your talent and how you use it is relevant here. But it's more than that. So here's the story. The master prepares to go away on a long journey, and he liquidates his holdings. In today's value, this is somewhere in the range, some would say, of about $5 or $6 million. And he splits it into 8 portions, each one called a talent, and he gives 5 to one servant, 2 to another servant, and 1 to the last one, each according to the likelihood of how well they will care for the fortune. The master is gone for a long time, and this 5-portion servant was an entrepreneur. Somebody who knew exactly what to do with millions of dollars, and he doubled it in the time the master was gone, as did the servant with the 2 talents. Doubled the money, which is pretty good. I believe they call that 100% return. Okay. So each of these servants was praised by the master upon his return. The exact words were, "Well done." One translator has the master telling them, "Wonderful." By the way, I'd like to come back to that, what the master said to the 2 first servants. So in hearing this story so far, one might expect the 3rd servant to do the same. Invest the money, work the fortune so that it doubles as the others did. But this is where the parable takes a sharp turn. While the encounters between the master and the first 2 servants are interesting and even inspirational, it's the encounter the 3rd servant has that Jesus wants us to notice. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning. It's the detail of what happens here that I'm convinced Jesus wants us to sit up and notice and remember for a long time. The 3rd servant is different. He takes the money, he digs a hole in the ground, he buries the treasure, leaving it there for a long time. And why? Well, we hear exactly why. It's because of his opinion of the master. He's quite open about this when he talks to him. He tells the master, paraphrased, "I know you have standards that are high and harsh, that you hate careless ways, and that you demand the best, and you make no allowances for error. And because I was afraid that I might disappoint you, I carefully buried the money and I hid it away. So here it is, safe and secure, the same as when you left it with me." And the master reacts in anger to this inaccurate assessment of who he is. And he calls the servant wicked, lazy. And then he rather sarcastically, I think this is kind of sarcastic, don't you? "So you knew, did you, that I am harsh and exacting?" These are really strong words from the master. And I'm intrigued by another translation of this. I think you all know how I love the Message translation. Listen to the way Eugene Peterson translates this passage. He's talking to the 3rd servant. The master is talking to the 3rd servant, and he says, "That's a terrible way to live. It's criminal to live cautiously like that. If you knew I was after the best, why did you do less than the least? The least you could have done would have been to invest the sum with the bankers, where I would have at least gotten a little interest." Then there's the statement of the master's verdict. Take the talent and give it to the one who risked the most, and get rid of this play it safe guy who won't go out on a limb. Throw him into utter darkness. Wow. So, as suggested earlier, it's clear to me that the intended focal point of this parable is right here. The interchange between servant number 3 and the master. That servant's assumptions about the master are intended, I believe, to prompt you and me to ask the question, who do I suppose the master to be? The master being God. Is God looking down on us disapprovingly, making sure we don't mess up? Is this our concept of God? Or is it more likely that God is the best high-adventure guide of all time? Someone who looks at you, looks with you at a high mountain and says, we can climb that, you and I together. Shall we? Is this maybe a picture of God? I believe this parable is teaching us that our lives as disciples of Jesus are to be more like this than being super careful, so as not to anger a God who is somehow out to get us. Jesus is calling us here to a life of high adventure, love-fueled high adventure. Now, I mentioned at the outset of this message might be a challenge to those of us who are naturally risk-averse, and I truly believe that much of this comes down to the question of, really, who do we believe God is? Is God the disapproving heavenly cop to keep us from messing up as a first priority? Or is God inviting us to go for it? I believe in the parable of the talents, Jesus is teaching that God is more like the latter. God is saying, here's a challenge. Go for it. About 12 or 13 years ago, we climbed Mount Pilchuck as a church staff. Probably those of you who were around that time weren't aware of this, but Chris and Stephanie and I and Brandon Bailey. I think it was Brandon's idea. He had done the hike many times. He was confident that we could all do it, so we started out early one Monday morning and started walking up. After several hours, which felt like 5 hours, but it was several hours, we all started politely asking Brandon, so, Brandon, how much farther is it? How many more steps are we going to be taking? And here's the deal. He always answered, oh, it's just a few more minutes. Smart guy. He'd been a youth pastor for at least 10 years by then. He's just, oh, it's just a few more minutes. Well, we finally made it to the top, Mount Pilchuck. If you know Mount Pilchuck and what's up there, it's pretty amazing. There's a rocky promontory at the top with a Forestry Service fire lookout cabin built right up on top of the thing. I mean, it is stunning once you get there. So we were up there on a clear, sunny, late summer day. What a fantastic view. We were all sweaty and exhausted, but little did we know that Brandon had planned for this moment. We're inside the lookout cabin, and he starts pulling things out of his backpack. Pastries. And he had this really cool miniature espresso maker that he had a little way of making a fire, and he started making us espresso and pastries. I mean, we had a celebration in the lookout tower. It was amazing. And it was his way, I think, of saying, way to go. You made it. It was literally a mountaintop experience that I will never forget. And that day, all three of us, well, other than Brandon, I think we were all at least in our 50s, and probably, speaking for myself, but also probably the other three of us, probably not in the best shape that we could have been in. But we went with him because he had said, oh, you can do it. You can do it. It'll be great. It's an adventure. Let's go. And we were just right there with him. Now, if we had been more cautious and perhaps even go we could have said, no, that seems like too much. Maybe we should just, go for a walk at Kayak Point or something like that. But I am so glad we went. Aren't you glad, Steph, Chris? I mean, it was just such an amazing day. She's not responding. It was really great. It was great for me anyway.
Memories are that way sometimes.
It was wonderful. But here's the question of the morning, folks. Here's the question of the morning. Is God calling you to an adventure? Not necessarily a mountain to climb or skydiving, but a life adventure. Maybe it's a mission or a new endeavor in your life. Are you facing a decision right now that involves unknown outcomes? Don't misunderstand me this morning. I am not advocating carelessness. That's not what this is about. But appropriate risk is the name of the game. And no risk is a recipe for a life devoid of joy and affirmation. When it's all over, and when I meet my master, I so desire to hear those words. I said I wanted to come back to this. So here it is. I want to hear these words. Well done. You have been faithful with little. Enter into the joy of your master. That will be the ultimate mountaintop experience. And what a joy it'll be to know that I didn't let fear or laziness win out, but rather I went for it. Who's in? Amen. Let's pray.